she's smiling. That is the part that will haunt him later, that even now, even in this moment when everything is unraveling, she is smiling. The fire in the study at Ashenvale Park has burned down to the kind of low orange glow that gives a room its secrets back. The rain is not polite rain. It strikes the windows in hard, irregular bursts, the way weather does when it has no interest in the human drama playing out behind the glass. Cecily Vane stands in the center of the room. She holds a letter in both hands, not because she is reading it. She has read it 3 times already, but because a letter is a thing you hold when you are deciding whether to burn it. Across from her, the Duke of Merrath sits at his desk. Julian Ashworth. His hands are still. His face is the face of a man who has spent a decade learning to reveal nothing, and he is, in the moment, revealing nothing. He watches her. He is waiting, in the particular way of men who are accustomed to waiting, because they have all the time in the world. Because time, like everything else, is something they can afford. He does not yet know what the letter contains. She does, and she is smiling. Now, before we go any further, if you are new to Whispered Thrones, welcome. Truly, this channel, Sam, is where we tell the stories of women who refused to be small. Women who smiled when the world expected them to weep, and wept only when no one was watching. If that is the kind of the story that finds you at the right moment, consider subscribing. We will be here. We will always be here. But now I need to take you somewhere else. Back before the study, before the letter, before the smile. Back to a drawing room in London. In the spring of 1816, where a young woman was running out of time, she woke every morning before the rest of the household. This was not a romantic habit. It was not the kind of thing Cecily Vane did because she loved the early light, or because she found the silence restorative. She woke before the household because she had work to do that the household could not know about, and the only safe hour was the one in which everyone else was still asleep. At a small writing table in her Aunt Dorothea's back parlour, with a single tallow candle because she was not profligate with the wax, Cecily Vane copied legal documents, not her own, not her family's. She copied documents for a solicitor's office on Chancery Lane, precise, close, meticulous work that required a steady hand and the ability to produce pages of clean text without errors, because errors meant the page was worthless, and the page was her income. She earned 6 pence a page. She kept the money in the lining of her winter cloak, sewn into the hem, because there was nowhere else it could be kept without questions being asked that she could not answer. She had been doing this for 11 months. To understand why a gentlewoman was hiding 6 pence in her coat, you need to understand what Cecily had, and what she didn't. What she had: 2 younger sisters. Ada, who was 17 and clever enough that if circumstances had been different, she might have been educated in the way her mind deserved. Prue, who was 14, who had a lame foot from a childhood fall and could not work and never would be able to, who collected flowers in a journal, and was, in Cecily's private estimation, the finest person in their small family, and an aunt, Mrs. Dorothea Fenn, a widow of moderate means who had been genuinely kind to all 3 of them in the years since their father's death. Kind, but not permanently positioned to be kind. Kindness runs out when money does, and Aunt Dorothea's money was not infinite. What Cecily didn't have: a name that worked in polite society. Not entirely. Name was not ruined, it was bent. Her father, Edmund Vane, had been a barrister, and 3 years before the events of this story he had died. And what he left behind was not grief, not really, but scandal. He had been involved in the fraudulent sale of a client's estate. The matter had been quietly suppressed by the courts, handled carefully by people with an interest in its silence. But quietly suppressed is not the same as forgotten. In a drawing room in London in the spring of 1816, the kind of people who know things knew about Edmund Vane. And they mentioned it, carefully, in the way that people mention something when they want it to be heard without being seen to say it. This meant that Cecily must be twice as careful, twice as pleasant, and twice as quiet as women with clean histories. She could not be seen to seek a match aggressively. It would confirm what people already suspected, that she was fortune hunting. She could not disclose the income from Chancery Lane without destroying her social standing entirely. She had constructed a small and necessary architecture of secrecy around herself, and she maintained it every morning between 5 and 6 o'clock at writing table in a cold back parlor. She was not bitter about this. Bitterness is a luxury of people who believe things should be otherwise. Cecily had stopped believing things should be otherwise when she was 21 years old, and watching her father's name be carefully excised from polite conversation by people who had once called themselves his friends. She had watched that, and she had understood something. The world did not change its rules for you. You learned the rules better than everyone else, and then you played. The thing about Cecily Vane, and this is the thing that will matter, is that she could read people. It was not a gift she had asked for. It was a thing that had happened to her. The way your eyes adjust to low light after you've spent enough time in the dark. She noticed what others overlooked. The hesitation before an answer that means a person is choosing between two truths. The way a hand moves to cover a glass when someone is talking about money. The specific arrangement of a person's stillness that means they are afraid. She had turned this into a tool, and she had been using it for years, and she was very good at it. She was also afraid that it made her father's daughter in a way she could not quite face directly. He had read people too. He had been perceptive, patient, strategic, and he had died with his name bent. She carried this in the back of her mind like a stone in a shoe. Not always painful, but never entirely absent. Ada needed a governess position. Prue needed permanence, a household that could keep her comfortably and without shame. Cecily needed, more than anything else she could name, to never again be at the mercy of another person's goodwill. This was the architecture of her life in the spring of 1816, when Mrs. Dorothea Fenn, in a state of mild excitement, mentioned a charity assembly, and mentioned, with careful offhandedness, that a certain Duke of Merrath would be in attendance, and Cecily Vane sat with her copy ledger and said, with perfect composure, that she thought that sounded very pleasant. She had already begun, in the quiet part of her mind, to pay attention. Julian Ashworth, Duke of Merrath, was 32 years old and had more power than he ever spoke about, which was what made him dangerous. He controlled one of the largest agricultural estates in Northamptonshire, 3 properties in Scotland, a voting bloc in the House of Lords that other men spent entire careers trying to cultivate. He was not loud about any of this. Men who shouted their authority were performing it. Julian simply had it, the way you simply have a particular quality of light in a room. It was there, and it changed everything in the room, and it required no announcement. He was not on the evening of the charity assembly, performing enjoyment. He stood near the far wall with a glass in his hand that he had not touched and watched the room with the expression of a man completing an obligation. This was, in fact, what he was doing. His solicitor had told him he needed to be seen in society before the parliamentary session, something about managing political optics, and Julian had agreed, with the same quiet efficiency with which he agreed to most things that were necessary but not enjoyable. A matron approached him with her niece. He was perfectly courteous. He said exactly the right things, and none of them came from anywhere inside him. The niece smiled up at him with the particular smile of someone who has been told, "This is an important moment," and he felt something that was not unkind but was deeply tired. He had been feeling that for years and had concluded that it was simply his constitution. He was wrong about that. But he didn't know it yet. Mrs. Fenn found him near the refreshment table. She was fluttering slightly, the way kind women flutter when they want something to go well and are not certain it will. She introduced Cecily. Cecily Vane looked at Julian Ashworth the way a person looks at a problem they are deciding whether to solve. He noticed that first. Then he noticed the curtsy, which was precisely what the occasion required, not a fraction more. Not the deep, almost reverential courtesy that women offered dukes in the hope that an excess of deference would be mistaken for charm. Just the correct courtesy, correctly performed, and then those eyes back on his face. He was not expecting to find that interesting. He found it very interesting. Cecily, for her part, noticed that beneath the perfect manners there was a man who found this room exactly as exhausting as she did. She noticed the untouched glass. She noticed the particular quality of his attention, precise, assessing, unimpressed by the room, but not contemptuous of it. He was somewhere else inside himself, while his exterior managed the assembly. She recognized this because she did it too. This was inconvenient. She had constructed a mental image of Julian Ashworth as a useful resource. She found herself looking at him as a person, which was not what she had planned. Then Aunt Dorothea, flustered and trying to fill a silence that had not yet appeared, mentioned Cecily's skill with correspondence. She meant it as a compliment, proof of Cecily's domestic usefulness, and Julian turned, with a slight shift in attention that Cecily felt like a change in barometric pressure, and asked her directly what she meant. The ground moved slightly under her. Cecily answered smoothly. She corresponded on her aunt's behalf, she said. Her aunt found writing fatiguing. She watched him decide whether to believe her. He did, she thought. But the way his eyes held hers for a half-second longer than necessary told her he was not entirely certain, and that he had found the moment interesting rather than damning. She filed this away. She filed everything away. 3 weeks later, at a dinner at the home of a mutual acquaintance named Lady Cresswell, Cecily learnt something that changed the shape of everything she thought she knew. She did not learn it dramatically. She learned it in the way that the most important things are learned. At the edges of a conversation she was not supposed to hear, while she was handing a cup of tea to a woman who had stopped listening and was therefore no longer useful as cover. Mr. Gareth Soane, the solicitor she copied documents for, was speaking to another guest across the table about legal matters in the general, unspecific way of men who want to sound important without saying anything. And then he said, very precisely, that he was rather more familiar with the Vane situation than was generally known. He looked at Cecily when he said it. It was not an accident. She kept her face entirely still. She set the teacup down without rattling it. She smiled at someone across the room and appeared to be thinking about nothing at all. Inside, something cold and systematic had begun. Soane knew she was working for him. Of course he did. He had employed her. But she understood, in that moment, that he also knew she was cultivating a connection to the Duke of Merrath, because she had been observed. He was not threatening her directly. He was letting her understand the shape of the cage. Here are the walls, Miss Vane. Here is the ceiling. I trust you find them comfortable. She went home that evening and sat in the back parlor without lighting a candle and thought for a long time. She thought about why a man of Soane's position would have been involved in suppressing the case of a minor barrister. The suppression of her father's case had been too clean, too quiet. Someone with real influence had arranged it. She had always known this, abstractly, the way you know a thing that does not yet have shape. Now it needed a shape. She began very carefully to investigate. She was in a position that most people would not have recognized as useful. She was a document copyist in a solicitor's office, which meant that she sat for hours each morning, with her hand moving steadily across pages while her eyes absorbed everything she was transcribing. She had access, through the ordinary course of her work, to correspondence and case files that most people in her position were never supposed to understand, because most people in her position were supposed to copy without reading. Cecily had never been able to not read. Over 3 weeks, she pulled on the threads, and then she found the letter. It was misfiled. This is the way the most consequential things arrive. Misfiled, misplaced, tucked into the wrong case, through someone's inattention, waiting. It was attached to a property transfer for a case she had been assigned to copy for a different client entirely. It was written in a hand she did not recognize, on paper with a seal she did recognize, because she had seen that seal on the letterhead of the Ashworth family solicitor's correspondence. And it was signed, at the bottom, with a name she had not expected to find, the late Duke of Merrath. Julian's father. She read it twice before she moved. Then she read it a third time. The letter detailed the arrangement. The fraudulent sale of properties in 1802. The cover. The man who had been brought in to manage the documents, to sign what needed to be signed, to bear the legal weight of what had been done, so that the Ashworth name remained clean. That man's name was Edmund Vane. Her father had not architected the fraud. He had been brought in to clean it up, to sign documents that made him appear to be the principal, to absorb the legal consequence of an order he had not given. Whether he had done this willingly or under duress, Cecily could not tell from the letter. What she could tell was that the disgrace that had bent the Vane name, that had narrowed her sister's futures to a corridor of anxiety, that had haunted Cecily's own understanding of herself for 3 years, that disgrace was not her father's. It was borrowed. It had been placed on him by a man with a title and the power to make the placement stick. She sat with the document in her hands and felt, not what you would expect. Not fury, not immediately, something more specific, a grief that had been aimed at the wrong person for years and now had to be reoriented. Her father, whom she had mourned as a weak man, a compliant man, a man who had failed his family through something she had always been afraid to name too clearly. He had not been weak, or if he had been weak, in that one terrible moment, the weakness had been in the face of something enormous, and she could no longer hold it against him. Then the fury arrived. It arrived quietly, which was the most Cecily kind of fury, cold and surgical and patient. She carefully made her own copy of the letter. She returned the original to its misfiled position. She put her copy in the lining of her winter cloak, beside the sixpence. Now she had something. The question was what she was willing to do with it. She continued the connection with Julian. She was careful about it. Careful, the way she was careful about everything, which was to say that she appeared not to be calculating at all. Julian Ashworth was invited to a house party at Ashenvale in October, and Cecily Vane was invited as part of Lady Ashby's party, and the two of them began what anyone watching would have described as a very gradual and very proper acquaintance. And it was that. It was also something she had not planned for. He was not who she had imagined when she had thought of him as a useful resource. He was precise, yes, he was controlled, but there was something underneath the control that revealed itself in small moments. A question asked when most men would not have thought to ask. A silence that was waiting rather than dismissive, the way he listened to her answers, as though the answers were of genuine consequence. She had spent enough time around men who listened to women the way. They listened to weather forecasts, aware that information was being conveyed, not particularly interested in the content. That Julian's attention felt startling. She was careful not to feel too much about this. She had a plan. Plans did not accommodate feeling too much, and then Soane escalated. At a card party in October, at an evening that should have been simple, Soane stood in a small group that included Lady Ashby and 2 other well-connected women, and made a comment about families whose names were cleaner now than their histories deserved. He looked at Cecily when he said it. The room noticed. She smiled and said nothing, but she felt the floor shifting. She felt it the way you feel ice giving slightly under your foot. Not breaking yet, but moving, and you understand that it will break. And the question is only where you are standing when it does. 2 days later, Soane sent word to her through the office that her services as a document copyist were no longer required. A change in office needs, the note said. No notice, no explanation. 6 weeks of savings in the coat lining. Ada's governess interview, which had gone well, which was supposed to lead to an offer. Cecily understood that if the Vane name was damaged further, that offer would evaporate. She sat in the cold parlor that night and counted what she had: the documents, the letter, the connection to Julian, which was not yet a formal courtship and might not become one, the knowledge, which was not nothing, that she had something he did not know she had, and then the moment that hurt, which she had not anticipated. At Ashenvale in the garden, in the thin October light that comes just before everything closes down for winter, Julian walked beside her and asked, carefully, with the particular gentleness of a man who is choosing precisely because he knows they could wound, whether there was anything about her family history she believed he should know. He was deciding whether to proceed with a formal courtship. She understood this without being told. She also understood that if she told him the truth, the full truth, the letter, what she had discovered, she would be handing him evidence that implicated his family and a reason to end things immediately to protect it. She would be handing it to a man she had known for 6 months and trusted. She realized with some alarm, significantly more than was strategically sound. She said, "There is nothing you do not already know. It was not a lie. It was a door left open." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded and looked out at the garden, and they walked on, and the conversation moved to other things, and Cecily felt the weight of what she was carrying as something specific in her chest. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it. That night, in a cold bedroom at Ashenvale, she sat with the copied documents spread on the writing table and considered burning them. She did not move toward the fireplace, but she looked at it. She thought about what it would cost her to simply become the woman Julian Ashworth thought she was: pleasant, capable, quiet, grateful. She was good enough at performance to sustain it for a lifetime. She knew this about herself, and it was one of the things she found most frightening. The thought lasted approximately 4 minutes. Then she put the documents in her trunk, got into the cold bed, and went to sleep. And perhaps you understand why I am pausing here, at the edge of what comes next, because I want you to know something before we go in. This is the moment everything changes direction. Not just for Cecily, for both of them. And I want you to be ready for it, because what happens in the next few minutes in that study is what you stayed for. Stay with me. November came. Swain had not made any further public moves, but Cecily felt him the way you feel weather before it arrives. In the quality of certain rooms, in the particular way conversation stopped when she entered. She had perhaps 2 months before. The whisper he had started became too loud to manage. And Julian was watching her, not cruelly, not suspiciously. He watched her the way a man watches something he is trying to understand, which was the most dangerous kind of watching, because it could not be deflected with pleasantness. One evening in late November, in the library at Ashenvale, after most of the party had retired, he asked her what she was actually afraid of. She deflected. She said she could not imagine what he meant. He said quietly, not looking away, his family had done harm to people it had no right to harm. He was aware of it. He did not always know the full shape of it. The room was very still. The fire was the kind of fire that has been well tended all evening and burns with a steady contained warmth. Cecily looked at him and felt the crack in the door widen. He was not confessing to her. He was offering her something, a signal, a crack in the careful exterior. An acknowledgement that there were things he carried that he did not carry lightly. He was giving her something he had never given anyone. She understood this. She was not certain he understood it. She said nothing that evening. She was not yet ready. But she went to bed thinking about what it meant. A man who had known about his father's failures, not everything, but the shape of them, and who had been carrying that weight in silence for a decade. Not out of indifference, not out of arrogance, because speaking of it would damage the people who depended on the estate's stability, and he had decided that his own relief was not worth their risk. She had thought she was looking at a man defined by control. She was looking at a man defined by conscience. They are different things. December arrived, and with it an evening at Ashenvale that Cecily had not planned for, but had, without quite admitting it to herself, been preparing for her entire adult life. He proposed to her after dinner, in the study. He did it with the careful honesty that was, she had come to understand, his most private quality. He was not eloquent. He did not reach for grandeur. He told her that he found in her company something he did not have a word for, which was the most honest thing a man like Julian Ashworth could say, because it admitted he was out of his depth, and he had said it anyway. He said he found he was more himself when she was in the room. He did not entirely understand it, but he was asking her to stay. He was asking her to stay. She accepted, and she was smiling. That smile, the one we started with, the one that would haunt him. The one that was not cruelty and was not performance. The one that meant something he was about to understand. She reached into her pocket. She set the letter on his desk. Then she let the silence last exactly as long as it needed to. She said she had accepted his proposal because she intended to be honest with him, and she had wanted to be certain he could not unsay his words before she was. The letter on his desk contained evidence that his father had ordered the fraudulent sale of properties in 1802 and had arranged for her father, Edmund Vane, to bear the legal consequences. Her father had died 3 years ago, still carrying that weight. Her sisters and she had carried it since. She had known this for 2 months. She had not told him because she had not been certain, until tonight, that he was someone she could tell. She paused. She was not giving it to him as a threat. She was giving it to him because he had asked her to stay, and she could not stay inside a secret. She waited. She did not move toward the door. She did not soften what she had said. She did not fill the silence with anything, because the silence was doing necessary work, and she had enough respect for both of them to let it. Julian looked at the letter for a long moment without touching it. Then he picked it up. He opened it. He read it. The whole of it, slowly, and she counted the time the way she counted everything, because it was the only thing she could do. And it was 3 minutes. And in those 3 minutes the only sound was the rain on the glass and the fire settling and her own breathing, which she was keeping very careful. He set the letter down on the desk. He did not look away from her. He asked quietly for her father's given name. Edmund, she said. He closed his eyes. It was a brief thing, a few seconds, but it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him, the only moment in their entire acquaintance when the careful exterior had simply left him. Then he opened them again. He told her there had been payments. He had sent them through a legal intermediary. He had not known the name. He had only known the property cases. The Vane family had received nothing because he had not known the Vane family was involved. He was sorry. He said it plainly. He said he knew it was insufficient. She looked at him across the low fire and the letter on the desk between them, and she felt something she had not been prepared for. Not vindication. She had prepared herself for vindication, and it was not that. It was something larger and harder to name. Something like the moment a stone you have been carrying for years is set down, and you discover that the weight of it had changed the shape of how you stand. And now you have to learn to stand differently. He was sorry, and he knew it was insufficient, and he had said it anyway. It was the most honest thing either of them had ever said to another person, and neither of them had said it alone. The legal matter of Gareth Soane resolved itself in January. Julian, fully informed of the shape and extent of what Soane had done and held, invited him to his study. A different meeting than the one we began with, a colder one, and laid out the terms. The evidence would go to a senior legal officer Julian trusted unless Soane resigned from his practice and made no further approach to any member of the Vane family. Soane was a man who had built his career on understanding where the leverage was. He looked at the Duke of Merrath across that desk and understood completely that he had none. He capitulated, and the rest of it, the ordinary, specific, hard-won rest of it settled into place. Before the wedding, Julian wrote something by hand, not through a secretary. A formal legal acknowledgement. He delivered it to Cecily himself. It was not a public document. It named her father. It said, in precise legal language, that Edmund Vane had acted under coercion in 1802 and had borne consequences he had not deserved. It cleared the name. Cecily read it once, set it down, and did not speak for a moment. Then she said she would like to have it framed. He had not expected that. She was glad it surprised him. She had it framed. It hung on the wall of the study, her study now, behind the writing table where she worked most. Mornings. Because some vindications are not for the world. Some are for the room you inhabit every day, the room that is yours, the room where you are not performing anything for anyone. Ada secured her governess position with a letter of recommendation that carried a name that now opened rather than closed doors. She was happy in a way that Cecily had not dared to count on. Prue lived in a cottage on the grounds of Ashonvale and discovered improbably a talent for watercolors. Small, precise paintings of the Northamptonshire fields that she produced in quantities that baffled and delighted everyone. The three sisters were no longer dispersed across the anxiety of precariousness. They were, quietly, safe, and Cecily wrote, not for sixpence a page before the household rose. Not in secret, not in a cold parlour, with a candle she could not afford to burn too long. She wrote because she could not stop, and Julian left her to it. He entered most mornings, set a cup of tea beside her without comment, and sat near her with a book he was not always reading. They had discovered, without discussing it, that they were both people who did their best thinking in the company of one other person who was not requiring anything of them. This was the most peaceful thing Cecily had ever experienced. He told her once that he thought she was the most frightening person he had ever proposed to. She took it as the compliment it was, which was the only appropriate response. Here is what this story was really about. It was about a woman who discovered that the thing she thought made her dangerous, the patience, the watching, the smile she wore while she waited, was not a flaw she had inherited from a disgraced father. It was a kind of courage, the courage to hold the truth until the right moment, and to give it freely rather than use it as a weapon. That is what separates a person like Cecily Vane from a person like her father's betrayers. Not the intelligence, not the skill, the choice. That is what you came looking for, I think. Not just the romance, though there is that, and it is the real kind. The kind built out of honesty rather than performance. You came for the moment when a woman who has been told her name is a problem looks at the most powerful man in the room and decides that truth is worth more than safety. You came for the moment, she smiled, and he didn't yet know why. Now you know. If Whispered Thrones is where you come for stories like this, subscribe. Stay with us. We tell these stories because they deserve to be told, and because somewhere right now there is someone who needs to hear that patience is not weakness, that watching is not passivity, that a woman who is smiling in a difficult room might be the most powerful person in it. And if you choose not to subscribe, well, Cecily Vane would find that very interesting. She would smile about it, quiet and composed, and you would spend the rest of the day wondering what she knew. She had a letter for you, too. Consider this your warning.